Hollywood loves to paint knights as elegant dancers in armor, swords glinting like jewels, graceful leaps, and perfectly timed strikes that look more like ballet than battle. But the reality of medieval combat was nothing like that polished fantasy. Real knights didn't fight with elegance. They fought with endurance, brute strength, and pure survival instinct. Every move was a desperate effort to stay alive inside heavy steel armor. Battles weren't decided by flashy swordplay, but by who could last longer, who could breathe through the suffocating heat, and who could land a single decisive blow before exhaustion took over. Imagine standing in a cavalry formation, your heart pounding as you grip a 12-foot lance made of solid wood and tipped with steel. It's heavy, awkward, and far from graceful, a battering ram designed to crush, not impress. Your warhorse, weighing over 1,000 pounds, shifts beneath you, muscles tense, ready to charge. The moment you spur forward, the ground shakes beneath hundreds of hooves. The sound is deafening, a thunderous roar rolling across the battlefield. As you lower your lance and aim, the weapon feels alive in your hands, trembling with speed and power. The collision is chaos. Lances slam into shields, pierce armor, and explode into splinters. Some men are thrown from their saddles, others are impaled, and horses stumble over the fallen. The air fills with screams and the metallic clang of steel on steel. The real skill isn't in the strike itself, but in surviving the impact. Grip the lance too tight, and the force could wrench your shoulder or throw you backward. Grip it too loose, and you'd lose your weapon entirely. Hollywood never shows this brutal moment. The shattering wood, the dislocated arms, the sheer violence of impact. And after that spectacular charge, the lance is useless, broken or buried in flesh and armor. The knight drops the splintered shaft and draws a new weapon, the poleaxe. This wasn't just a stick with a blade. It was a masterpiece of engineering. One end chopped through helmets, the other crushed them. The spike at the top pierced armor like paper. It offered reach, leverage, and control. Everything a sword could never provide. In real battle, the poleaxe was the knight's true weapon, turning armored duels into deadly, exhausting struggles where grace had no place. Only raw power and survival did. The poleaxe was a machine of purpose, not a prop. A single weapon that solved every problem armor forced on the medieval fighter. At the tip sat a spike for brutal thrusts. One side bore an axe for chopping, the other a hammer for crushing. And the shaft itself became a lever for hooking, tripping, and controlling an enemy's balance. Weighing 7 to 10 pounds and balanced along its length, it felt alive in an experienced hand. Watch a true veteran wield one, and the cinematic myths evaporate. There was no flamboyant swinging, only tight, economical motions honed to exploit tiny weaknesses in metal and flesh. Combat with a poleaxe demanded patience and calculation. The axe blade hooked an enemy's limb or weapon, creating openings. The hammerhead struck helmets not to pierce but to stun, to rattle brains inside skulls. The spike found the hairline gaps where armor joined and left a wound. Reach mattered. From 6 feet away, you could probe and punish a swordsman, forcing him to close while you controlled tempo. If he closed the distance, you choked up on the shaft, sliding your hands nearer the head to turn the poleaxe into a short, savage club for grappling ranges. At every distance, the poleaxe adapted. That versatility is why it dominated tournament lists and real fights alike. The terrifying thing was decision time. Facing a seasoned poleaxe master, you never knew whether your next problem would be a brutal thrust, a hooking trip, or a hammer blow that blurred your senses. Your responses had to be split-second correct. Pick the wrong counter and you found yourself on the ground, helpless under steel. Knights who trained with swords often abandoned them against well-armored foes. The poleaxe simply solved more problems faster. When men picked their own weapons for life and death contests rather than pageant showdowns, they chose tools that ended fights efficiently, not artistically. Then there were the blunt concussion weapons, the mace and the warhammer, instruments of physiological destruction rather than elegant killing. A military mace was brutally simple. A 2 to 3 foot shaft capped with a flanged or spiked head weighing a few pounds. The flanges focused force into tiny contact points, denting plate, collapsing rings of mail, and transmitting catastrophic impact through steel into bone and brain. A solid strike to the helm rang like a bell. Vision blurred, balance failed, and the wearer became a puppet of pain. You felt such a blow through your whole body, an internal concussion that no metal could fully absorb. Warhammers offered the same idea with a different set of mechanics. A hammer face for crushing and a spike for piercing. On the field, you'd often alternate techniques: hammer to deform the metal and stun the man inside, then spike to exploit the newly created gap. These weapons were not subtle. They didn't rely on finesse. Their genius lay in simplicity. You didn't need decades of sword schooling to be lethal with them. You needed timing, hip power, and endurance. The rhythm of mace combat was primal. You heard the dull thuds before you saw the result. Each strike bled stamina from the opponent until the last man standing was simply the one who could keep swinging longest. The clang of metal on metal was the battlefield's heartbeat, a raw percussion that drowned thought. You'd hear the ring of maces before you saw the faces behind them. Dull thuds, grunts of effort, labored breathing growing heavier with every exchange. Maces turned armored fighting into an endurance contest. Each swing demanded full-body commitment. After a minute, your arms would burn with lactic acid. After a few minutes, your blows would slow. The man who kept swinging longest usually won. Swords weren't the elegant arbiters movies make them out to be. They were the backup tool you reached for only when every other option had failed. When you finally drew an arming sword, it felt like concession. These were broad, muscular blades, 2 to 4 pounds, 30 inches long, made to hack at gaps and thrust when openings appeared, not to pirouette with finesse. In real combat, your sword arm screamed within minutes. Parrying jarred wrists. Every block ate energy. That's why fights were short bursts, 10 to 15 seconds of violent exchange, then a stumble back to breathe and reassess. Novices wasted themselves in the first frantic minute and paid with their lives. The sword was versatile, but it demanded that the rest of the fight had already gone wrong. True mastery against plate was not about swinging. It was about control. You'd half sword, sliding your offhand up the blade to use the tip like a short spear, stabbing into visor slits or armpit gaps. You'd flip the blade to use pommel and crossguard as hammers, smashing visors or levering jaws aside. Cutting strokes bounced off quality plate. The art was precision, not power. Every strike aimed at a tiny vulnerability. The joint at the elbow, the mail at a gauntlet, the seam where helm met gorget. Those micro-targets won fights long before any cinematic duel ever would. When one knight pinned another, the unglamorous work began. The dagger, the true ender of armoured men. The rondel or misericord was ugly and efficient. A stiff, narrow blade 12 to 15 inches long, built to find the human beneath the metal. You'd control the prisoner's arms, feel him struggling under your weight, then probe systematically for gaps. Press the blade into a visor slit, the armpit, the groin, the neck joint. Apply body weight until the tip found flesh. There was no music, no clean cut, just ragged breathing, metal scraping on metal, occasional screams if the thrust missed vitals. This was mercy only in name. Wrestling and leverage decided more battles than flashy cuts. When armor neutralized strikes, knights became grapplers, hands on arms, fingers at weapons, feet scraping for purchase in mud. Throwing a man in 50 pounds of plate required technique and stamina. A successful throw led to dagger work. A missed throw left you exposed. The brutal calculus of medieval combat boiled down to who could manage their breath, keep their balance, and keep swinging. Films sell choreography. Reality demanded endurance, timing, and the cold willingness to finish a man on the ground. That, not a single cinematic stroke, was how armored knights truly died. Real combat had no rules, no choreography, no noble pauses for honor. When two armored men clashed, the fight rarely ended in the way stories claim. You wouldn't see elegant duels or shining swords deciding victory. Most knights didn't die from a sword stroke at all. They died afterward. When they were down, pinned beneath another man's weight, their strength gone and their breath too shallow to scream. The dagger, small and cruel, was the true executioner. It didn't win battles, it ended them. Its purpose wasn't heroism, it was survival. And in the mud of a medieval battlefield, survival was the only mercy that mattered. What movies never show is how much time knights spent grappling. When every fighter wore armor that could shrug off sword blows, wrestling became the only way to create a kill. You'd close the distance, weapons sliding uselessly off metal, and grab whatever you could. An arm, a wrist, a helmet rim. The real fight started the moment you made contact. Two men, each carrying 50 pounds of steel, twisting and shoving for balance while the air inside their helmets grew thin. It wasn't pretty or cinematic. It was exhausting, suffocating, and brutally personal. You could feel your opponent's breath echo through the armor, smell sweat and iron, and hear your own heartbeat pounding inside the enclosed metal cage. Every movement became a battle of leverage. You'd hook your leg behind your enemies, trying to trip him. He'd counter by shifting his weight or locking his arm around your shoulder. The armor scraped and clanked, metal grinding against metal as the two of you stumbled like beasts trying to topple one another. If you could throw him to the ground, you'd use that moment to climb on top, pressing him into the dirt. If he resisted, you'd twist his weapon arm until he dropped whatever he held. Every inch of movement cost energy, and every second felt like a minute. The armor turned each exchange into a test of endurance rather than elegance. Knights trained for years to master this grappling. They learned how to turn an opponent's momentum against him, how to choke him by pulling back the gorge of his helmet, and how to create a brief opening for the dagger's final thrust. The real mastery of combat wasn't about striking harder, it was about surviving longer. Both fighters were usually too tired to keep swinging. The fight slowed, becoming a grinding test of willpower and breath. Eventually one man fell, then came the dagger. The rondel dagger was small but terrifying in its purpose. Once a knight was pinned, his armor that once saved him became his cage. You'd see the victor brace himself, use both hands, and drive the narrow blade into a visor slit, an armpit gap, or the groin joint. You wouldn't hear noble music or see a clean cut. Only ragged breathing, scraping steel, and the dull thud of a man's last struggle. The weapon was called the mercy, not because it was kind, but because it ended the misery of combat that could drag on endlessly otherwise. Forget the duels Hollywood loves. Real battles were short and savage. A full fight might last a few minutes at most, but every second was pure exhaustion. A knight had only 15, maybe 20 minutes of effective combat before heat, fatigue, and oxygen deprivation made continuing impossible. The armor trapped heat like an oven, every breath tasting of sweat and metal. Even the strongest fighters would collapse if they pushed too long. That's why discipline and stamina, not style, decided who lived. The weapons that shaped victory weren't swords, but lances, poleaxes, maces, and daggers. Tools designed for impact and practicality. Lances broke lines before contact. Poleaxes crushed helmets and hooked riders from horses. Maces dented armor and rattled skulls inside. The sword came last, a weapon of desperation used when nothing else remained. The techniques of real combat looked awkward because they had to be. Every motion was dictated by armor's limits. The aim wasn't beauty, but function. Every move meant to exploit one weak spot, one breath of vulnerability. There was no time for finesse, just raw, brutal calculation. In the end, medieval combat wasn't about glory. It was about endurance. It was about who could keep breathing inside 50 pounds of metal long enough to strike one last time. Knights didn't fight like the movies show. They fought like men drowning in heat and exhaustion, wrestling in the mud, praying their strength didn't give out before the enemy's did. And when one finally fell, it wasn't a sword that decided his fate. It was the quiet, merciless whisper of a dagger finding the gap. Reality was not shining swords and heroic duels. It was daggers grinding into armor gaps while one man pinned another into the mud. Both men were gasping for air, every muscle screaming, lungs burning beneath 50 pounds of steel. That was how armored knights actually died, not standing tall, but crawling, clutching, suffocating in desperate struggle. There was no glory in it, just survival. Your modern mind, shaped by movies and games, can't comprehend the true violence of it. You think you know battle because you've seen choreographed fights, but the moment you felt armor's crushing weight, your fantasy would collapse. Inside a helmet, every breath echoed like thunder. The heat suffocated you. Your arms felt like stone after a few minutes of swinging. Each parry jolted through your bones. You'd realize that strength didn't matter as much as endurance, the ability to keep fighting when your body begged to stop. Real combat wasn't cinematic. It was chaos. Every move was raw instinct. Every step, a battle against fatigue. One mistake meant death, not because your opponent was faster, but because you were too tired to lift your weapon again. The truth about knightly combat is hard to digest. Battles weren't decided by style or speed. They were decided by stamina, leverage, and sheer willpower. The man who won was the one who could wrestle longer, who didn't panic when buried in armor and mud. There were no perfect strikes, no elegant forms, just the ugly, desperate rhythm of men trying to survive another few seconds. The techniques weren't graceful, and the weapons weren't beautiful. Everything was functional, designed for one purpose, to kill before collapsing. Knights didn't fight like the movies show. They didn't duel endlessly under moonlight or spin blades with precision. They fought like men trapped in metal cages, drenched in sweat, their vision narrowing with exhaustion. They fought with trembling hands and ragged breaths, using whatever weapon still worked, whatever movement their armor allowed. Medieval combat wasn't glorious. It was short, brutal, and painfully human. A reminder that beneath the steel and titles, knights were just men, fighting not for honor, but for breath.